Welcome back. I'm glad you're here. Last week's episode covered the first 2 days of our fourth week of summer camp, and this week's episode covers the second 2 days of our fourth week of summer camp. So here we go. On Wednesday, I just take a lot of notes about random things sometimes. One cool thing that happened was when the kids came in for lunch, one student was already there, and our kids aren't always observant about the space they take up. So I've mentioned before that kids can take off their shoes at Starfish. And when we started that, we had to have a conversation about put your shoes by the wall, not in the middle of the waiting room. Sometimes kids bring lunch boxes, bags, things like that, and they'll just leave them wherever. Even there was one day during game time where somebody was trying to join a group, but there wasn't anywhere for him to sit. And he was asking the kids to move. And like, there just wasn't a concept of that. So our kids don't always have a concept of the space they take up in relation to other people. So on Wednesday, a lot of the kids who come for lunch have certain places they sit every day, just kind of out of habit. It doesn't matter at all, but just out of habit, they tend to sit in the same place every day. And so there's two kids who tend to sit next to each other, and one of them was already there. And when the second one came in, he kind of hesitated before he sat down. And I looked and I noticed that the kiddo who was already there had his stuff all over. And he recognized it. He recognized that the other kiddo wasn't sitting down because his stuff was in the way, and he moved it all. I thought that was awesome, just to be able to notice that the other kiddo had hesitated and then to see why and to do something about it. I thought that was just really cool. The student who had been talking to himself continued to do that on Wednesday. And what I started doing, my goal was to make him aware that he was talking out loud. And so every time I would hear him do it, which was multiple times each day, I would say, "What?" And then I would say his name. So, like, "What, Steph?" Because I'm trying to make him aware that I can hear him, trying to make him aware that he's talking out loud. Most of the time when I would do that, probably 75% of the time, he would stop talking. But about 25% of the time, he would say it, whatever he was thinking, so that I could hear him. And so every time he did that, I would take that opportunity to engage in that conversation with him, because I want him to not talk out loud when he's talking into the void. But if he actually wants to talk to another person, I want to reinforce him doing that. So I was kind of doing both at the same time. I was pointing out to him that he's talking out loud, but not to anybody. And I was reinforcing when he did say something directly to me and it was a full, complete thought. So kind of balancing both of those at the same time. I also put a note on here. I don't think I talked about this the day that I actually turned this into an activity. I think I forgot to write it down. And if it doesn't get written down, it is nowhere in my memory. All of you guys who have neurodivergent kids or teach neurodivergent kids, you will probably recognize that one thing that they typically don't do is acknowledge people that they know. When Starfish Social Club was bigger, when we had a bunch of kids, it would be funny because I would know what time it was. I would know there were kids in the waiting room, possibly 8 kids in the waiting room, but it was silent because none of them were acknowledging each other, even though they know each other. Some of them have known each other for years. And so that became part of our lessons at Starfish. This is in the March through May module, where we talk about that once you're acquainted with somebody, once you know somebody, you have to say that you have to acknowledge them when you see them. You can just say, "Hey," you can just wave. But when you know somebody, when you're an acquaintance, we acknowledge them when we see them. So we had done this. I had stopped the group and we did this as an activity a couple weeks ago, I had everybody sit on the floor and we actually practiced everybody leaving out the door, coming in the door, and everybody saying hello to them and them saying hello back. It's two ways. It goes both ways. We have practiced this, but every week we have new kids. So I brought it up again on Wednesday because I noticed when kids were filtering in throughout the morning that sometimes nobody was saying anything except me. And so oh, guys, remember? And then we talked about it all over again because some of the kids weren't there the week that we had talked about it. And a lot of the kids this summer are new. They haven't been through the year-round program. So reinforcing that again on Wednesday, that when you see somebody that you know, we're expected to acknowledge them and say hello. You can wave, you can say what's up if it's a peer, whatever the case may be, but we're expected to acknowledge them. You know, it's all these little things. On Wednesday, one of the kids had a really, really rough day and ended up not being able to stay through the day. At Starfish Social Club, I think because of my background is as a behavior specialist, and I also have a background as a former difficult child myself. And so my specialty is difficult kids. I really excel when it comes to working with difficult kids. And so because of that, we get a lot of them at Starfish, especially when they first come. But also we're able to work on a lot of things at Starfish that might not have been worked on in other places because sometimes people don't know how to support some of the things that are going on with our kids. Sometimes there just aren't the resources to support them, whatever the case may be. One of the things that happens with that when somebody's having a really difficult day is I also have to balance supporting them with the needs of everybody else who's there. Sending somebody home is always my last resort. In the 8 years, this is our 9th year of summer camp, I've maybe done it, gosh, maybe 5 times in 9 years. It's my last resort. But when it starts interfering with everybody else's experience, that's when I have to make a decision. And unfortunately, we got to that point with one of the kids on Wednesday where it was significantly interfering with everybody else's experience. The other thing that happens when somebody's having a really rough day is that everybody is observing it and it colors their opinion of this person. It colors this person's reputation. I remember many years ago when I was a consultant in a school district, and there was a kiddo who just was, I think he was having a lot of mental health issues. He was doing really bizarre things in the classroom. And the other kids, some of them were afraid of him. Some of them just wanted nothing to do with him. Everybody was avoiding him. And I actually recommended pulling him out of the general education classroom until he was in a healthier frame of mind, because all that was happening was day after day, his peers were developing a bigger and bigger sense of how weird this kid is. Like it was doing nothing to benefit him in any way. So we pulled him out and had him working with a teacher just by himself until he was able to get to a mentally healthier place where he could go back to the classroom and not be such a spectacle to the other kids. So that's part of it as well, is when somebody's having a really rough day, it really affects their reputation amongst everybody else. So for all those reasons, this kiddo wasn't able to stay for the rest of the day. Anytime somebody has a difficult day, we have a group conversation about how we all have a difficult day sometimes, because I really want to build empathy with the students. And at the end of the day, when we were getting ready to go home, some of the kids had started to mention it. And so I just asked the whole group, I said, if you had a difficult day, would you want everybody else talking about you? And they all said no. And then that was the end of it. So just that helping them relate, helping them understand. One more thing I want to say about Wednesday, the activity that we did on Wednesday was a writing activity. In the past, one of the writing activities that everybody loves every time we do it is we write a story as a group, but everybody can only add one sentence at a time. So we go around the group, somebody gets to start, and then the next person adds the second sentence, and the next person adds the third sentence. And the only expectation is that your sentence makes sense with what's happening in the story. This is really fun. For some kids, it starts out pretty difficult. Some kids, their cognitive processes aren't quite there for them to be able to add on to someone else's thought. But the more we do it, the more they figure it out. This week, what I did is we did group stories, but we did them one word at a time. So everybody got to add one word at a time. One student this was really a lot to ask of him. It was hard for him to process that concept. He didn't really have a concept of what kinds of words would make sense after another word. So sometimes he would just say a random word. He didn't really have a concept of only being able to say one word. So he was really struggling with this. I did a combination of two things, which is my typical go-to when somebody's genuinely struggling with something. On the one hand, I scaffold and I support. So for the first several times it was his turn, I would give him suggestions and have him pick one. Then after the first few times, what I started doing is prompting him, but also not letting him not answer. So I was expecting an answer from him, but I was also prompting and supporting him. And then toward the end of it, he started being able to generate words on his own, which I wasn't sure if we would get there in one day. It's about 40 minutes or so that we spent doing it, maybe 30. So I didn't expect him to figure it out by the time we were done, but he started to figure it out. One of the things he was doing every time it was his turn is he would cover his face with his hands and put his head down and immediately say, I don't know. Every single time it was his turn, putting his hand over his face, putting his head down, saying, I don't know. Some of you guys probably recognize this from your own kids as well, especially if they're anxious or if they have perfectionist tendencies, just that immediate, I can't do it. I don't allow that response to things. So when I get that from kids, I scaffold, I support, and I wait it out. I'm pretty good at figuring out what kids can do. And so I'll find that line and I'll scaffold and I'll support them. And then once I know we've hit that line, then I just keep reinforcing and keep supporting and take some of the scaffolding away. And so that's what I was doing with him. I knew that he could with my help. If I was prompting, if I was giving him suggestions, I knew that he could do it. And so every time he would say, you put his hand and say, I don't know, I would either give him some prompts or I would just give him some reinforcement because I knew that he could. And so every time our kids are successful, they start to break that a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. So if we were to do this activity again, I would still expect him to have the same reaction because clearly that's an automatic reaction for him. But I would expect him to do it. I would expect it to take fewer turns for him to stop doing it than it did this week. Because at this point, it's just an automatic reaction for him, but it doesn't always have to be. We can definitely break those automatic shutdown, refusal, I don't know kind of things. I don't know. I've met so many kids who that becomes their default. I don't know. And it's when they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by something. If we just step back and give them some time and space, almost always they will think of something to say. I've seen that with so many different kids in so many different situations. Even I remember I had a kiddo who used to say that even when I would ask him just a social question, like, what's your favorite video game? I don't know. And then I would just wait a little bit and then he would answer the question. Sometimes kids do this because they don't want to say the quote unquote wrong thing, even though there's never a wrong thing at Starfish Social Club. Even there were a couple times this kiddo said a word that didn't make sense. And so I would just say, do you want to try this word? Right. So at no point was I ever like, oh yeah, that doesn't make sense, or that's wrong, or no, try again. I would just positively, do you want to try this word? What about this word? And so at no point did I make him feel like he was wrong, especially when my goal is for him to try. So sometimes kids have that immediate shutdown response for all kinds of reasons in all kinds of situations. So that was our day on Wednesday. On Thursday, same kid, the kiddo who was struggling with kind of talking to himself, and I'm working on helping him recognize he's doing it. I stepped that up a little bit. And what I was doing on Thursday was, instead of just saying what and saying his name, I would say, who are you talking to? And if he could answer that, then I would show him how to get that person's attention, which we do by saying their name, right? Oh, you're talking to so and so. Say his name so you can get his attention. But most of the time he wouldn't have an answer because he wasn't talking to anybody. But again, my goal is to increase his awareness of that, his awareness that not actually talking to anybody, but that we can all hear him talking. He will be back for week 5, so I'm excited for us to keep working on that. On Thursday, the kiddo who had a really rough day on Wednesday, I was determined that we were going to make it through Thursday. I hate sending kids home so much. I was determined we were going to make it through Thursday. Part of my strategy was just really supporting him, and part of it was protecting him. The kiddo that was there this week that always wanted to win, winning is always at the expense of someone else. Anytime something's a competition, you win at the expense of someone else. And a lot of times this other kiddo was the one whose expense it was at just by default. One of the things that had happened, I'm trying to, either on Tuesday or Wednesday, one of the kids always brings this little like foam ball, and he kind of was kind of bored on the playground, I guess. And he asked another student if he wanted to play catch with him. This was back in June. And I didn't actually expect the other student to say yes, because not very many of my kids are very athletic. Not very many of them enjoy playing catch, for example. But the other kid said yes. And then this turned into a thing for them. At some point during week 4, they started playing catch again, and almost all the other kids joined them. It was really cool. It's like everybody just kind of migrated toward them. They ended up forming 2 teams. One kid who didn't really want to play, but he designated himself as the referee. And then there was the kid who always wants to win everything, who decided he was like in charge of the game. And so he was trying to tell everybody what to do. But that also involves arguing with people, right? Because nobody else can tell anybody what to do. Nobody else can decide what this game is called or whose turn it is. So there was definitely that going on at the playground this week as well. On Thursday, they were all playing this game again. And the space on the playground where they play this game, there are these contraptions. I don't really know what to call them, but they're metal, and it's like a cage, and you stand on it and it automatically rotates, like just on its own based on gravity and physics and science. I don't know. So all you have to do is stand on it and hold on, and it will start rotating. And based on how you move your body, you can make it go faster if you want to. So there's only 3 of them. And this is the area where the kids had been playing catch. And so this is where everybody gravitated toward. So all 3 of them, somebody was on each one of them. And at one point I noticed the kiddo who was just really wanting to be in charge of everything this week, he stepped off to go say something to another kid. And the kiddo who had had a rough day on Wednesday jumped on, which turned into the two of them physically battling over who was going to be, I'll just call it a swing, over who was going to be on this swing. I had happened to see the first kiddo get off. And so I just intervened and I said, very firmly said, you got off and he got on. So it is now his turn. And I was just very firm about it. So the other kiddo got his turn to swing. And then after a while, he got off. And of course, the first kiddo immediately got back on. A couple minutes later, the kiddo who had gotten off decided he wanted to swing again. And so he went and asked if he would let him have a turn. And the kiddo just said no. He just kept saying no. So the student looked at me and I called him over to me and I just said to him, have you noticed that he doesn't like to share? And I said it out loud so that this other kiddo could hear me. I said, have you noticed he doesn't like to share? And he said, yes. And I said, so my suggestion is to ask somebody different, because you know that if you ask him, the answer is going to be no. And then the other kid started to respond that it's not that I don't like to share, but then there was no way for him to finish that sentence because he has shown all week that he doesn't like to share. And so part of what I want all my kids to recognize also is who to spend their time around, who they choose to spend their time with. And that was a big thing. I noticed even when this kiddo was disrespectful to other kids, a lot of the kids still chose to play with him and spend time with him. And I really want all my students to be able to start to recognize the way that people treat other people, even if it's not you, even if you've never been the one that this kiddo has said something unkind or unfriendly to. I want them to be able to recognize that he's doing it to other people. And I think for a lot of our kids, they just kind of have this silo effect where they really don't notice the way that other kids talk to other people or act toward other people. They don't always notice that. So it's almost like a protection mechanism, is helping my students just pay attention. Who do you get along with? Who do you enjoy playing with? And who would you prefer not to play with? And then make your decisions accordingly.
Along the same lines, one of the things that happened on the playground on Thursday is that one kiddo, sometimes when the kids push the merry-go-round, one of the rules of the merry-go-round is if you're going to ride, you also have to take a turn pushing. And so sometimes when kids push, the other kids will holler like, it's not fast enough, or go faster, or something like that. And one of the things that we had addressed from the beginning of camp this year is that if you're saying things like that, you get to push. And so the kids have kind of learned that. So one of the interesting things that was happening on Thursday is some of the kids were telling a certain kid he was pushing too fast, even though he was pushing pretty normally. And so I felt like it was just another one of those situations where they were being just not as friendly as they could be. And then when he jumped on to ride and they started to push, they started pushing really fast. So I just pointed out to them that they were telling one person he was pushing too fast, but then they were pushing even faster than he was. I do always try to call out things like that when I see things that are kind of not fair, unjust, whatever the case may be. I try to point those things out. And I also want the kids who are around to notice things like that as well, to notice if somebody's saying something like that to you or to someone else. When we got back to Starfish, I had decided we were going to do a drawing activity today. Just like most days, I wasn't really sure what we were going to do. I wasn't really sure what it was going to look like. And here's what I ended up doing. I had everybody sit around the table, and I told them I was going to put two colored pencils in front of them. And that's all I told them. So I took two colored pencils for each student, but they were the same color, just a different shade of that color. So I went all around the table. I think we had 8 students on Thursday. So I went all around and I put, so for example, in front of the first student, it was 2 shades of green. And then in front of the next student, 2 shades of purple, and then 2 shades of red, and went all the way around the group that way. One student immediately started complaining about the color that was in front of him. And I actually had paid attention, and we had all boys on Thursday. And so I intentionally put out some pinks and some purples, but I intentionally put them in front of the kids that I knew wouldn't complain about it. So this kiddo I think he had green in front of him and started complaining about the color that was in front of him. I did point out to them that they actually didn't know yet what we were doing, so they might want to wait before they started complaining. I was a little impressed that he was the only one who said anything. I then gave everybody a piece of paper and I set the timer for 2 minutes. And I told them that for 2 minutes, they could draw anything they wanted to with the 2 colors that were in front of them. When the timer went off, I told everybody to stand up, to get their paper, and we all moved clockwise to the next seat, which means they all now had 2 different colors in front of them. It was a little bit chaotic, helping everybody understand what we were doing, but then we did that all the way around the table. 2 minutes with each station, each seat, each set of colors, all the way around the table until they got back to where they had started. I was really impressed with how well everybody did with this. And we talked about it afterward. There were several things about this activity that were challenging. Number one, they had no idea what we were doing when we started. Number two, they could not see the timer. So even once they figured out what we were doing, they couldn't see the timer to have any idea of when it would go off. Number three, they were really, they had to stop when the timer went off because people would start moving. So sometimes when we do things with timers, some kids have a hard time stopping. But in this activity, there's somebody coming behind you waiting to sit where you're sitting. So they all had to stop every time the timer went off and get up and move. They also, I didn't notice anybody looking around the table to see what the color options were. So most of them were just kind of going blindly from one seat to the next. And I also pointed out to them at the end, they all got a turn to share their picture with the group and talk about what they had made. And I pointed out to everybody how they all had the same colors. They started with a different color, but by the end of it, they all had access to the same colors, but they had created such different art between the 8 of them. I always think that's just really cool to point out to them how everything they create is so different. I did have one student that I noticed after the first couple turns, he stopped drawing. He continued moving with the group. He was very quiet about it, but I noticed he was no longer drawing. And that's absolutely fine. The students don't ever have to do anything. But he continued moving with the group. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't complain about it. I think in the first couple seats, he had drawn what he wanted to, and then he was done. But it was a really great option for him to just keep moving and flowing with the group. He wasn't ever disruptive to the group. He didn't ever speak out or complain. He just kept moving with the group. And so even, I don't think any of the other kids ever even noticed that he wasn't drawing anymore. So I thought that was a really great option for him to do that. For game time, I really wanted to mix up who was playing together. I think this week the kids had gotten a little comfortable with each other, but with certain other kids. So I really wanted to mix that up. And so what I did was I separated them into 2 groups and I had them each go on a different side of the room facing each other, kind of like Red Rover. but I intentionally put similar kids on one side and then other similar kids on the other side so that they could not pick each other. Because the task for game time on this day was to be a partner with someone from across the room. So the way I set it up, they weren't partners with somebody they had been playing with all week. They weren't partners with someone who was really similar to them because of the way I set it up. So that's how we did game time. I did have one kiddo who kept trying to pretend play with the game, and his partner is not a pretend player. And so his partner is also pretty quiet and laid back. And what I noticed is that while this one kiddo is pretend playing, his partner's just sitting there. Multiple times I pointed that out to them and pointed out that he has a partner and that they're expected to play a game together. His partner ended up leaving and joining a different group. And then that kiddo realized that if he wanted marbles and tiles, he was going to have to do the same thing because now his partner had left. He did come to me before the end of the day and say that he thought that he should apologize to his partner for not playing games with him. And so I thought that was really cool. That was a really cool moment of awareness for him. His partner, I think, didn't really care. He had moved on and was playing games with other students. And the two of them get along. They're not two kids who argue or don't enjoy each other. I think in that moment, his ability to think about another person was just really limited. And so he was just doing what he wanted to do. At the end of the day, I have one student who this was his first week this week, and he's really struggled with playing with the marble towers with the group. He wants to build his own structure and not have anybody else play with it with him. The challenge is that there's only so many pieces to the marble tower. And so anytime more than two kids want to play with it, they've got to play with it together because there's only so many pieces. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, this was a challenge for him. He was really having a hard time with this concept. On Thursday, the other kids started stepping in and giving him the feedback that I had been giving about how there's only so many pieces. We've all got to do it together. And he eventually did. He listened to what they were saying. He was not happy about it, but he let one other kid play with what he had built with him. And so I thought that was a really big moment for him. He was still frustrated. He was still annoyed, but this was the first day this week that he had allowed someone else to build with his tower. He does not struggle with this in any other place in camp. He is very friendly and open to other kids with everything else we do at camp. It's just the marble tower that has been kind of a sticking spot for him. And I'm not sure if it's the marble tower itself or if it's the fact that this is the end of the day and he's just kind of peopled out. I'm not sure which one, but either way, I thought it was a really big deal that he listened to the other kids and the other kids were giving him feedback without being rude about it, which is a big thing that we talk about. And then they were able to do marbles together, he and one other kiddo. And then some of the other kids were building something else together. So that was week 4 of our summer camp. We had another amazing week and we have one more left to go. I'll see you next week.